Good morning. My name is Don Rush. I'm with Zerto. We're going to talk about disaster recovery as a whole as a concept. No product marketing pitch in this for you guys, but if you do like what you're hearing, be sure to stop by our booth. So I've been doing disaster recovery both on the vendor side as well as on your side of the table now, probably about 17 years. So I'm pretty knowledgeable in this area. And I still remember the days if the email server went down, nobody cared, even if it was down for a week. And now if it's down for 5 minutes, the CIO's calling around going, what's going on? So I understand your pain. So to kind of level set the conversation, we're going to start with some key terms, so everyone's kind of on the same page. So BCDR, so business continuity, which is the practice of continuing your business 24/7, or if there's an interruption, whatever that plan is to continue in an efficient manner. Whereas disaster recovery is the systems and policies in place within your IT infrastructure and applications to handle that disaster that does happen. Feel free to ask questions. I like interactive conversations throughout the presentation, so no need to hold them all the way to the end. The next concept is RPO, so recover point objective. This is the amount of, if I lost a system and I was going to recover that system in whatever the manner is the amount of data loss I'm going to have. An example I would say is like a tape backup. So if I did a backup at midnight last night and I have to restore that system at noon the next day from that backup, that RPO at that recovery is 12 hours. So recover point objective is whatever your objective of how much data loss can I sustain when recovering that system. Some applications in say the financial industry want that RPO in seconds, where in other applications maybe I'm doing nightly batch loads and I can rerun the batch load. So maybe a 24-hour RPO is acceptable for me for that given application. The other is RTO. RTO is the recovery time objective, and that is once I've declared a disaster and I'm working on implementing my plan for disaster recovery. How long does that take? Some applications are business critical. I want those back up in a matter of minutes, where there are others that if it takes me 24 hours to bring that system back online, that's okay. It may seem obvious that the business should be dictating what these RTO and RPOs are. However, that's not the case that I see it typically. The business is going to go to the IT department and go, do we have a backup? Are we doing any kind of disaster recovery? And a lot of people do implement things. They like snapshotting on arrays or backups, and we'll explain that to the business and go, yeah, so the best with what we have, we can do a 4-hour RPO and a 4-hour RTO, and businesses tend to accept that. My challenge to IT people usually is make the business make those decisions. Obviously, the first thing any business is going to say is oh, well, my data is important. I want a sub 5-minute RPO and a sub 5-minute RTO across all of my applications. That's usually what I see from businesses. And I usually tell customers, accept that, go out and source a solution and show them what that's going to cost. And when they get that $3 million price tag, they go, okay, ERP is the most important, and so let's focus on ERP and email. This other maintenance application I don't care about. That can take longer. And so start with that high level number and then work backwards from there, and then define it from that perspective instead of doing a one size fits all for all of the applications within the environment. Typical solutions, if I had a failure, whether we're talking about power failures, ransomware, which is the big thing today, file deletions, things like that. So if I had an event, usually customers' first line of defense is backups. Backup RPO is typically maximum of 24 hours. If I did a backup at midnight and assuming that my failure was all the way to when I was starting my next backup, which is the maximum window, is going to be 24 hours. The other way of doing is doing snapshots within storage arrays or within VMware, things like that. However, snapshots are something that customers choose not to run every 5 minutes. So at best, typically I'm going to get a 4-hour RPO on that. So I could have up to 4 hours with the data loss in that type of solution. These are the typical solutions that most customers I see use. Major disruptions are becoming the norm. As I said earlier, 15 years ago, if the email server was down for 24 hours, nobody really cared. So that was not a major disruption to a business. But as now businesses are relying more on IT infrastructure to run their day-to-day operations, and that businesses are becoming more 24/7, an email server being down for 8 hours is a major financial disaster to a company. So they're not those disruptions are not just that East Coast blackout or flooding in Houston that happens maybe once every 10, 15 years. They're becoming more and more the norm. So again, it's not just natural disasters, power failures, hardware failures, network outages, software failures, etc. 1 in 3 companies have declared a major disaster in the last 5 years. And I like to use in the non-disruptive. My current example is we know a big storm hit Houston, and there was a chemical plant in Houston that had some issues, made national news. They were storing a chemical that required refrigeration, and if it was not refrigerated, it would combust. And so they did everything that they could. First, they had refrigeration in these containers, had street power coming in to power those refrigerants. They had another line of defense. They implemented some generators in that environment. So if the power went out, the generators would kick in. And then on top of that, they also had a nitrogen system. So they had multiple layers of protection at this chemical factory. Well, in this event, so obviously it flooded and they lost street power. Everyone knows that you start getting feet of water, you're going to start losing power typically. Great, they had their backup generators kicked in. Well, nobody expected 6 feet of water in this area. Those generators were 4 feet off the ground. So after it got up to about 5 feet, flooded the generators failed, and as well as the nitrogen system, the components for that were only about 4 feet off the ground as well. So as that water rose, they lost all of their protection within that local site, and these containers started to catch fire. So the point of that story is just because you have one layer of protection doesn't necessarily mean that you're fully protected in your environment. Constantly I get customers who go, well, I do backups. That's great. How long is it going to take you to restore those backups? How much data loss are you going to have from those backups? For some applications, whatever you get with backups is completely appropriate. For other applications, you might want another layer of protection around, what if I lost the whole site? And are all my backups there? If I'm replicating to another site, do I have infrastructure in place in that other site to be able to bring up those applications? So multiple layers is important. And to be honest, disaster recovery solutions are expensive to put in for an insurance policy. And as these solutions get easier and easier to implement and use, they can be used for planned downtime. I don't know about you, but most Fortune 500 companies getting an hour worth of downtime even on a Saturday now, is very hard to get. So by being able to use whatever solution that you're using for that insurance policy of a disaster can also help you augment for planned downtime. So take that running application that's running in your production data center today, and if you need to, say I need to do HVAC maintenance or power maintenance on that data center, it requires me to bring that data center down. Instead of taking an 8 or 12 hour window of time of outage, use that insurance policy that you already have in place. Bring those applications over to your DR facility. So I take 10 minutes of downtime at the beginning, and my applications are up and running in that second site. I do my maintenance for 8, 12, 24 hours, whatever time it takes. And then I can take another 10 minutes of downtime and bring that application back. So these tools are becoming easier and easier to use and less complicated, and being able to move an application, especially in a virtualized world, from one data center to another is becoming very easy. Because again, business is 24/7 nowadays. So if we kind of look at the evolution of IT, so we started with physical servers. I ran a data center that had racks and racks of servers. We moved into virtualization, so it allowed us to consolidate, added some extra protection within our environments, things like high availability between physical servers, so no application was dependent on a single physical server. And then we moved into software defined, so instead of just the application, now I've got soft firewalls and soft networking and things along those lines that help me to make my environment more resilient to disasters. And then now we're removing the boundaries of my own physical data centers and now looking at cloud style providers, whether we're talking about an Amazon or Azure, whether we're talking about true public cloud or gov cloud, or managed hosting providers, things like iland and Blue Lock and Quest Systems. And we really need to, instead of just thinking about disaster recovery of that insurance policy around natural disasters, that 1 in 5 years that might happen to me, moving more towards IT resilience. It's not just a backup insurance policy for that natural disaster, but it helps me add resilience to my systems within my day-to-day operations. And when you start thinking about it from a resilience perspective, instead of thinking about it, that thing that I do in that smoking hole crater, and I think about it as more of something that I use in my day-to-day operations, it allows me to focus on the business and keeping the business up and running no matter what happens. Maybe I'm a retailer, and Black Friday and the week before Christmas are my really busy times. And if I'm running out of capacity, using that tool, instead of doing a disaster, using it so I can utilize that other infrastructure that I may have either in another site or in the cloud to augment my compute and resources in my production data center during those moments of spikes. So if we look at how we protected ourselves in the physical world, this is an example of a company, about 80,000 employees, pretty substantial revenue, 40 billion. They had a single data center in Atlanta, and they ran about 180 applications in that data center. They had a power outage, a localized power outage. They had a UPS. Unfortunately, that UPS failed on them. They had no DR sites, so they weren't replicating that data anywhere. They weren't doing any kind of virtualization, so maybe I only lost half of my data center. If I was doing virtualization, I could move those apps onto other physical infrastructure, but for them, it was all physical server-based. So they had about 500,000 customers impacted, negative press. That reminds me of it wasn't my issue, but I had a customer in Virginia who had a storage outage, and the state of Virginia ran their DMV, they ran their Health and Human Services Department. They had multiple agencies on this one storage array, and of course the next day it was on the front page of the Washington Post. DMV was down for 8 hours. HHS was down. All of these government services were down and impacted. And so negative press is an issue for a lot of businesses and agencies. They also lost revenue because those systems are down, so they couldn't book new business. So again, first problem was they had no DR site, so there's no resiliency to any kind of localized outages. Really not a lot of ability to test. So they were doing backups. And so if I'm doing backups, when was the last time somebody's done it? Unless I'm doing a single item restore or actually restoring a system, who tests their backup systems? Very rarely anybody tests backups. And especially if you're still going to tape media, after 6 months, the viability of restoring from tape media is actually pretty low. So they had no ability to test. They had no DR site. So if they had a DR site, they could do some limited testing. So if they were doing like storage-based replication from one site to another, they could do some limited testing over there. They actually had another site to bring those applications up. So they had a guaranteed recovery of some sort. If they were doing virtualization, as I said earlier, if I only had lost part of that data center, in virtualization, I can move those applications very easily. Without virtualization, I might be having to run extension cords from one rack to another to power that other rack to get those applications back up and running. With virtualization, again, I can move something very easily from one site to another. So we moved into the virtualization world. In the virtualization world, again, I could do VM-based backups. I'm going to have, at best, an RPO of 24 hours, or sorry, at worst, a data loss of 24 hours. That's still a lot of data depending on the business or agency we're talking about. And then the recovery, if I've got to restore 500 VMs, how long do you really think that's going to take? It's going to take a while. There are a lot of disk-based backup vendors out there that promise a lot of things. And if I'm restoring like 4 or 5 VMs, they're actually pretty fast. But if I've got to recover an entire environment, that could take a long time. So recovery from a backup is going to be typically in multiple days, unless I'm only doing maybe 10, 15 total VMs. Again, not something people test very often. And if I'm going to tape media, it's going to be a higher failure rate. And it's complex and time consuming, especially if I got to do it. If I wanted to test, how long would it take me to restore these 100 VMs? It's going to take a lot of time and management and hours for somebody to test that. Or I could do storage-based replication. So I can take that data loss, instead of thinking about it in a day worth of loss, I can move that down into hours. And then recovery. Since I'm not restoring from a backup system, that data is already online. Instead of taking a day or days to recover, it typically in hours. So my return to operations might be in hours versus days now with storage-based replication. And typically people who do storage-based replication, maybe they'll do an annual test. And I'm being generous with that because I know a lot of people who implemented plans 5 years ago and still haven't even tested it. So, but it is more robust, but it is complex, and usually storage-based replication is not virtualization aware. So an example of that would be is on a storage array, if I had a storage LUN presented up to my virtualized environment, and I had 100, say we'll go to a more realistic number, I got 25 VMs that are running on that one storage LUN. It's an all or nothing thing. If I only care about 5 of those virtual machines that's on that storage LUN, if I'm doing storage-based replication, I'm replicating all 25, whether I care about 5 or all 25. So now as we move more into the software defined, taking more and more services out of the hardware layer And also kind of talking about hybrid cloud at the same time. Let's skip over that. Yeah. Those services that I've ran, so for example, replication, I can now run that up in the hypervisor layer instead of relying on the underlying storage platform. So now I'm VM aware. So instead of replicating all 25 VMs when I only care about 5, I can replicate only the 5 that I care about. And being more in a software-defined model, I now have multiple options on what I can do with that. I could have my own on-prem secondary data center, or I could take it out to Azure GovCloud. So by me being more software-defined and not relying on hardware allows you to be more agile, both as the customer and us as developing products, in giving you more options to be more resilient within your data center. Cloud we really do see as a tipping point. A lot of people have pushed off doing DR because they don't want to have another data center or don't have the money or the space. Usually it's time, money, or space are why people don't have secondary data centers. And we view cloud as being that tipping point to push more and more people into doing DR. So instead of having to have your own infrastructure, hiring that out to like a managed hosting provider, somebody who does DR as a service, whether you do the white glove at like a Quest Systems or a Blue Lock or an iLand, or you do it on your own through something like Azure or AWS, it's becoming a lower cost of entry, both from a management perspective and from a cost perspective. Sure.
My concern, I'm a small city.
Okay.
Is my path out.
Mm-hmm.
We have a disaster, let's just say Governor.
Right.
And my path is gone, so now I'm stuck. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Until vendor XYZ gets our path.
Right. So in that example, so the question, just to repeat for people watching this later, is if I'm a small city, for example, and I've got one telco provider in that city, and I'm using that to get to my DR site, what happens if I lose that in that example? So what I would say is to me, it's a judgment call. I could continue to run locally within and know that I'm not replicating that data out of my geographic region, or I can choose, because that I've lost that path, I'm going to go and use that DR location, and maybe I've implemented a satellite-based network connection that allows me to at least over the internet access that other location or some kind of other, and you could also use that for the replication path too, instead of being reliant on that one local loop provider. So that's what I use most of the time, but looking at more at a wireless solution for continuity of operations as well. Yep. So again, DR as a service is kind of the new big thing with moving more to software defined. A lot more people are moving to things like AWS and Azure. Just as a quick survey, how many people have something running in a public cloud today? Anyone? 1, 2, 3. So over half the room. It's becoming more and more prevalent. If I asked that question 3 years ago, I maybe got one hand in a room of 100 people. So it does help you reduce costs and makes you more scale. So if I look at it from, if I'm running my own production and DR data center, I essentially am doubling costs. I've got power, cooling. One thing people don't really realize is the amount of people management it actually takes, because I have a whole nother environment. So things like Cisco UCS comes out with a new firmware, so I have to apply it to my production environment, but I also have to apply that to my DR environment. So cost of maintenance, essentially, from a people perspective, almost doubles. I'm usually locked into a location, so maybe today being across town is okay. but in a year or two, maybe I need to have that geodiversity. I need to be out of my region. Well, it takes a lot. If I'm running my own DR data center, it takes a lot to forklift that and move it. And trust me, I've done it. I've moved a DR data center from Colorado to Arizona in 36 hours. Because DR is important, and having that DR down, you want to minimize it. So it's a lot to manage. So a lot of companies are now looking at going to a cloud-based model of replicating that out to a provider, letting them manage that infrastructure, because this is really just my insurance policy. And I can instead of using capital dollars to manage a DR data center, I can just pay it out of OpEx. And my usually my reoccurring non-DR charges are pretty low. And what's going to happen is I'm just paying for storage to house my data out there. And then if I have a DR, then I'm just going to pay a metered rate on compute. So I boot my systems up out there and bring those systems up. And that's the only time I'm paying for all that CPU power and everything. And so when I'm not in a DR situation, my costs are actually pretty reasonably low. So these are going to be some of the key questions to ask. The first one is when sussing out either a product or a provider. So if you're looking at DR as a service, or you're looking at selecting a product to do your own environment, can you see your RPO? Can that provider, whether it's software or a company, on real time tell me how far behind I am at any point in time? Can I log into a web portal and go, yep, I can see I'm an hour behind, or I'm 10 minutes behind? And part of that is gives you confidence in the product. If I can't tell how far behind I am, how much confidence am I going to have in that product? Can I prove how long it's going to take me to fail over? So whatever product or service that I'm using, if I do a DR test, well, first of all, will they allow me to do DR tests? And when I do that test, will it really tell me how long it took to do that failover? Both for just knowing what your RTO is, and on top of that, between the RTO and the RPO, can I prove, if I have auditory regulations that dictate that I have to have some kind of DR plan, will the product help me with those compliancies? For example, there's a product on the market that will kick out a report that says, here's when I started the DR test, here's when I finished it, here's who initiated it, did they consider this test a success or a failure, input some notes, and it kicks out a whole report that says, here's all the steps that we went through for this DR test, and there's a signature line on the bottom for either an auditor to sign or the IT person who did it. And then you can turn this over to regulators, to like your CISO or whatever, to prove that I have a DR product or service implemented and that it works. Can I test my design? So along with being able to prove that RPO and that RTO is I can look at a dashboard or somebody can tell me something and I can believe them, but proof is really what I need at the end of the day. So, I as a vendor could tell you, oh yeah, I can give you an RPO of 10 minutes. I could tell you that till I'm blue in the face. And I could really mean it with my background and everything, knowing your environment, I could mean it. But do you really know until you test it? And you don't. I tell customers all the time, don't take my word for whatever I tell you. Test it. Make sure it works. And so whatever you select as a tool or a service, do they allow you to test? Will they allow you to test while production's still running? Will that product create that environment, say in an isolated bubble for you? Because I know I don't like coming in on a Saturday to do a DR test. I'm sure you guys don't either. Will the product or service allow you to do a DR test at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday while production's still running? And instead of having to bring people in on the weekend, I can bring it up in an isolated environment. And from an infrastructure perspective, I can check to make sure everything comes up as it's supposed to. I can have the application people log into it, do data validation checks to make sure. I said that this data is only going to be 20 minutes behind, but until you actually do a data validation check to see if it's only 20 minutes behind. Can I select my SLA? Again, this goes back to what I started off in the very beginning. For certain applications, maybe my ERP or my payroll system or something along those lines is my number one application that I need to have running. So I want that to be as close to near sync as I can. And maybe I've got, I don't know, a maintenance application. Maybe the people who do the maintenance on my building have their own little server with an application on it. Maybe that's less critical. Can I lock that into a lower SLA? So does whatever product or service that I choose allow me to tier my recovery? Because again, ERP and email is going to probably be the thing that I want the most. And this building maintenance application is going to be the thing that I care the least about. So does it allow me to do that? And if I'm going to a provider, do they give me multiple pricing models for that? Because I don't want to pay for gold service that I pay for my ERP, also for this other application that I need some kind of protection for, but I don't need tier 1. So can I tier that pricing? And can I trust the cloud? If I choose a provider, do they have multiple customers that I can talk to and reference? Will they do some kind of POC in my own environment? Can I instantiate the service for 30 days in my environment, replicate my data out to your managed hosting, and do a DR test before I commit to a 5-year or 10-year contract, whatever it is? And this is the one that I find, and even when I was relatively new in the space, never thought about, is whether I'm talking about I'm in a colo facility where all I'm doing is renting floor space and power and managing my own equipment, all the way to a white glove service for DR as a service, can they help me implement it? That's usually the obvious one that people do ask. How much of that will they handle? But the other one is at 3 o'clock in the morning when I have a disaster, who's answering the phone? Who's actually on site? Typically in a smaller colo facility, they'll have some kind of junior help desk person who's there from like 7 p.m. to 6 a.m. and that's the only person on site. So if they're providing me a white glove service where they're going to manage that whole DR for me, if I call this guy up in the middle of the night, or girl, person, are they going to have to call somebody? So are they just answering phones and then they got to call somebody, and now the network engineer has to either log in or drive in, and then you got the VMware administrator, does he have to drive in as well? To me, that's the most overlooked question when talking to managed hosting providers is who is there after hours? And that could make or break your RTO, because if I'm telling my business, I can have you back up in say 4 hours in this hosting provider that I've selected, and I've tested it, but I've tested it during the day. Who knows what's going to happen at 3 o'clock in the morning? That 4-hour RTO that I've promised the business could get elongated 8 to 12 hours, depending on whether people can work remotely, they have to drive in, etc. Or maybe they can't get a hold of the person, and now they've got to call down through multiple people. Also, does whatever solution that I choose make it easy to come back? So there's the example I like to use in this case is AWS provides services and actually software at a cost that allows you to replicate into AWS. They actually make it really easy to get into AWS. So if I'm using AWS as my DR location, I can replicate my data very easily in AWS, and I can fail over, and I can instantiate my application in there. Now, what happens when I gotta come back? Amazon's very smart, and they make it very easy to get into AWS. They make it very hard to get back out of AWS. So whatever solution that I choose, do they make it easy? Once I failed over into that environment, do they make it easy once I've repaired my DR or my production location to bring that application back on-prem, if that's the choice that I want to make? And I'll tell you, AWS doesn't make it easy. Also, it used to be that my email server was one server. My ERP application was one server. Now I deploy an application, and that one application might be now 15 virtual machines. Sure, I can do per VM based replication. Maybe I use a host based replication product, or even down in VMware, they have some replication product, but they replicate on a per VM basis. Well, if I've got multiple VMs that are part of a single application, I might be, in those types of models, I might be recovering one VM that's 4 hours behind, and another VM that's 5 minutes behind, and another VM that's an hour behind. What's that do to my application? A lot of applications, if I'm interconnected between multiple dependencies, don't like systems coming back at different point in times. Usually my example of this is a document management application. So I've got a database that houses metadata about documents, and I've got a file repository that are the actual PDFs, okay? If I restore both of those systems independently, and let's say the database is newer than the file repository, what does that mean? I've got metadata in a database about documents that I don't even have anymore. Or the inverse, if the document repository is newer than the database, I've got documents in the document repository that have no metadata attached to them, so I'm never going to find them. Do I really need them anymore? So will whatever solution that I select allow me to take these disparate systems and lock them together and recover them wholly as a single application? Essentially take a container, and so what I can do is I can take that document repository and that database, put them together in whatever that solution is, and recover them as a single unit at the same point in time, which allows you to make that recovery much easier. I don't have to go and let's say I've got 5,000 documents that take up space. Do I want to, if I don't have the metadata for those documents, do I need those documents anymore? No, I should just get rid of them. And inverse, the same thing with the database. So being able to lock those applications together and recover them together saves you recovery time and that. So will it allow me to lock those things together? Because really what we want to do is minimize the impact to the business, both from a DR perspective, so we get that insurance policy, replicate out to another site. These tools are getting much easier to use. So instead of just waiting for that again, 1 to 5 year disaster, using these tools for planned downtime. A lot of times these tools can also be used part of change control. So typically when I want to do an application software upgrade, I got to go through change control process. And then one of the first things that's ever asked is if that upgrade goes south, what's your recovery model? A lot of these tools can help you with that too. Especially for replication products that do like journal-based replication that allow me to rewind that data so I can set a checkpoint and go, well, here's what the system looked like before I loaded that Oracle patch or that SAP patch or whatever. I can bookmark that, and then I can go do my upgrade. If something happens during that upgrade, a lot of these tools allow you to roll that system to look like it did just before you did that upgrade. So if we look at kind of the business impact to an outage, so this is an example of a company that's about $100 million in annual revenue. If I'm just doing backups and no other type of protection, let's say I take the worst case data loss and the best case return to operations. So worst case of 24 hours worth of data loss, and I get everything back up and running within 24 hours, that's about a $800,000 revenue loss to a company being down 24 hours. On average, if you take the revenue and average it out throughout the year. If I'm doing snapshot-based replication in a storage array, and we'll take, again, worst case data loss of 4 hours, best case return to operation of 4 hours, I've reduced that. I'm now down to about 136,000. And then if I look at something where I'm doing more kind of real-time based replication, where now my data loss is somewhere in sub-minutes, and I can get an RPO, say, sub an hour, now I've taken that impact down to $3,000. So the cost of one of these kind of solutions, especially when you can use it for more than just that my whole data center caught fire example, the ROI on a lot of these tools are getting much better because, again, I'm not just using it that 1 in 5 years. If I want to take an 8-hour outage in my data center to do maintenance and move those applications into whatever my DR location is easily, now the business can continue to run. I don't have to wait for the lowest revenue. So, for example, I'm never going to get downtime at a retailer during Christmas. But if I can move those applications from one data center to another, and I have an emergency maintenance, now I can do that. And I want to minimize impact. So ransomware is the new big thing right now, and it's getting pretty bad. A lot of these products now allow you to rewind in very fine granular points in time. So, for example, if I had an attack, and say it was a ransomware, and they encrypted my file system, okay? Let's say that happened at noon. Some of these products are so good that I could roll back to 11:59 in 35 seconds. So what did I lose in data? I lost 25 seconds worth of data. Instead of having to incur downtime, pay some black hole entity some money, and maybe I get my unlock key. One hospital got hit, and they got their unlock key, but it was 900 separate keys because they encrypted 900 separate systems. So every system had a different key. Could you imagine how long it would take to input 900 encryption keys? Well, what if I could just roll back that data 35 seconds? And with software defined, it allows you to not be locked in. So if I'm using like storage-based replication, I've yet to find a storage vendor that will allow me to replicate from one brand of storage vendor to another brand of storage vendor. It doesn't exist. Moving the stuff up in the hypervisor layer allows you to move away from that vendor lock-in. So now I can enable new technology. So today I'm buying vendor A. Tomorrow I can buy cutting edge vendor B and not disrupt whatever I'm doing for my protection. Allows me to consolidate, and it allows me to protect with lower RTOs and RPOs because I can pinpoint what matters to me. I'm not replicating all 50 VMs that are on that storage array. I'm just replicating the 5 that matter to me. So now I'm using less bandwidth and I have less systems to recover on the remote side. And I can evolve. I can start with my own on-prem solutions today, and a lot of these products will allow you to migrate to newer solutions in the future. And does it provide simplicity for you? Does it make it easy? Because if it's complicated, you're not going to use it. I've implemented complicated network management platforms. As the customer, I've implemented them, and I still didn't use them because they were just so complex. And that's it. Any questions, thoughts? All right. Well, thank you.